Welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Revelation. Keep in mind, I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. Now, we're going to study the man of sin. He's probably more known as the Antichrist, though the Antichrist is sort of a misnomer name. While, yes, he is a Antichrist, in fact, he is the ultimate Antichrist, the prophetic name given to him is the beast or the man of sin, and he will be the last world leader before Jesus comes back. And so as we get into chapter 13, and I know many people will look at this chapter with great intrigue, because of the mark of the beast, and the computer chip is the mark computer chip. Okay, we'll get to all that later. But I want to study this, as we study this book, I'm going to give a background information on him. Because he just didn't come out of anywhere. The fact that John devotes an entire chapter to this man, the Apostle Paul devotes a chapter to him. Jesus mentions this man, and of course Daniel repeatedly mentions this man in his prophecies. So he has a very key place in the prophetic timeline. So I want to do a background story before we actually get to dive into chapter 13. I want to read one thing, however, and as we sort of last time we talked about chapters 12. Now remember, chapters 11 and 12 and 13 are parenthetical chapters, as John was revealing Jesus as the King, the King of Kings, administering justice and righteousness and judgment against the wicked. He pauses, right? And then steps back and says, now this is what else is going on. And so in chapter 11, we saw the witnesses, the two witnesses who will witness with great power against a wicked and evil generation. We also saw in chapters 12 where the spiritual ruler. I also got to make a correction, something that in chapters 12, I made a mistake, and when I was talking about how Satan was pictured and as the rulers, and I said the king of Syria is actually the king of Tyre. So I made that mistake. So Satan is the prince of the power of the air, and in Ezekiel, as he was pictured, it talks about the prince of Tyre. And then it talks about the king of Tyre, and Satan is the king of Tyre. He's the real power behind the kingdoms of the world. And so what we saw in chapters 12 was Satan's main drive was he was trying to destroy first the man-child that Israel gave birth to. And when he couldn't do that, he turned his fury towards Israel. And those who keep the testimony of Jesus, and they would go through great persecution. Now, in chapters 18, chapters 12, verse 18, he said, and he stood on the sand of the sea. So that's how he ended chapters 12. And this is referring to Satan, who is standing on this shore, and before him is this great sea. And we said that when you see in this prophetic context, when it talks about these great rivers or floods or great seas, it's usually talking about the masses of people. So when we get into chapter 13, and he says, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. In other words, he's going to arise up out of the sea. Now, I want to go back to Daniel, because we're going to see how this plays into how he comes up His kingdom and power is going to rise up out of the masses. But I want to go back again and spend some time, and I want to do again some background information on this man. I want to take some time because it's important to understand this, so that when we read this chapter, we kind of got an idea of a good understanding of how the prophetic prophecies concerning this man unveils. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, you remember, and as I said, Daniel's prophecy, this book, chapters 1 through 6 is Daniel receiving the prophecy, and then chapters 7 through 12 is Daniel interpreting the prophecies. And basically, it's one interpretation of this image that Nebuchadnezzar receives in chapters 2. So I want to read that again. I want to go over that again. And then go through Daniel. Because again, now I want to zero in on the last kingdom. But let me go back. In chapters 2, this is Nebuchadnezzar. This is Daniel giving Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation of the dream. Now in verse 36, he says, "Now this was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and glory." Now, by the way, remember, let me go back. I'm going to go back to 31 because I think this is important. Let me go back to 31. This is actually Daniel's telling of the dream here. Verse 31, he says, "My king, you were watching, and a colossal statue appeared, and the statue, tall and dazzling, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was terrifying." Now, this is an image of a human, okay, and as we will see, human governments. Verse 32, "The head of the statue was pure gold, its chest and arms were silver, its stomach and thighs were bronze, its legs were iron, and its feet were partly iron and partly fire clay. And as you were watching, the stone broke off without a hand touching it, struck the statue on its feet and its iron and the fire clay, and crushed him." Now, pay attention to that phrase, "the stone struck the image on his feet," because that speaks of a timeline when this stone is going to crush this image during the time of this king, by the way, because by the time this stone, okay, crushes the feet, all these other kingdoms would have been passed because of time. Verse 35, "Then the iron and the fire and the clay and the bronze, silver and the gold were shattered and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor. Then the wind carried them away, and not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the stone became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So that's, again, all of Daniel now is going to be it's the interpretation of this dream, these four kingdoms. So verse 36, "This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and glory. Wherever people live, or wild animals, or birds, or air, he has handed them over to you and made you ruler over them. You are the head of gold." Now, just a quick note. One, notice God is the sovereignty that's ruling in the affairs of men. In other words, God is ruling this. So keep that in mind. And he's talking about these kingdoms or world dominating kingdoms. Okay? He says, "After you will arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule the whole earth." Verse 40, "A fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron, for its iron crushes and shatters everything. And like iron that smashes, will crush and smashes all the others. You saw a feet and toes, partly of potter's clay, fired clay, and partly iron. It will be a divided kingdom, though some of its strength and iron will be in it. You saw the iron mixed with the clay, and the toes and the feet were partly iron, partly fired clay. Part of the kingdom will be strong, part of it will be brittle. You saw the iron mixed with clay. The peoples will be mixed with one another. but will not hold together, just as iron is not mixed with fired clay. And in the days of those kingdoms, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, and his kingdom will not be left to another people. It will crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, but will itself endure forever. And you saw a stone that break off from the mountain without a hand touching it. It crushed the iron, bronze, and the fired clay, silver, and gold. The great God has told the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true and the interpretation is certain. Now, that is the first. I want to bring this up to speed. This is what the prophecy is about. This human image, world kingdoms from Nebuchadnezzar until Jesus comes, or what we would call the end of the age, until Jesus comes back. Okay? That's the prophecy. Even when we get to Revelation 13, this is what prophecy is about, the interpretation of it. Now I'm going to pick this up in the next video, so I'll see you then.